This is the Sundeep show.
After World War II, Germany was hit hard by population displacement and the resulting refugee crisis. With the conclusion of the conflict, millions of individuals were displaced, both domestically and internationally. Let's explore the causes and consequences of the crisis, emphasizing the challenges faced by Germany and the immense suffering that its citizens had to bear. We're launching into the first part, the causes of displacement and refugee crisis. People were forced to flee their homes in search of safety and stability as a result of World War II's catastrophic effects, which left many cities and towns in ruins. The human and material costs of World War II were enormous. It has been estimated that the nations involved will have to pay more than $1 trillion. Germany suffered severe infrastructural damage, with numerous cities and towns leveled, trains and bridges demolished, and the countryside burned. After the devastation caused by the war, Germany had a protracted restoration phase. During the war, Germany lost a great deal of industrial power, as well as human life. Death tolls in Germany ranged from 6.9 million to 7.5 million, or roughly about 8.5% of the total population. A great number of German cities were devastated throughout World War II. Out of the 54 major German cities with over 100,000 residents, only Lübeck, Wiesbaden, Halle, and Erfurt managed to survive relatively unscathed. With 75% of the city destroyed, Würzburg was the worst hit city, followed by Dessau, Hamburg, and Mainz. The downtown areas of about 70% of the major cities were completely devastated. During the war, Germany had utilized the forced labor of people from regions that it had captured. These people had to deal with uncertainty and displacement after the war. Numerous Germans were compelled to work as slaves by the Allies following the war. As Stalin wanted 4 million German workers at the Tehran Conference in 1943, the idea of utilizing Germans as forced labor for reparations was first raised. There was also forced labor in the final protocol of the Yalta meeting in January 1945. Both UK Prime Minister Winston Churchill and US President Franklin D. Roosevelt agreed to it. Several million German prisoners of war constituted the greatest group of those forced to work as slaves in the Soviet Union. The majority of German prisoners of war who had survived in Soviet forced labor centers were liberated in 1953. As soon as nations having a German minority started to be overrun in 1944, the Soviet Union started to capture and transfer civilian ethnic Germans. Numerous citizens were abducted from nations like Yugoslavia, Romania, and even areas of Eastern Germany. Post-war Poland included substantial areas that had been part of German states for centuries and had a majority of German speakers within its redrawn borders. Before being compelled to leave their own land, many ethnic Germans in these places spent years as forced laborers in labor camps. Upon the conclusion of World War II, millions of people throughout Europe, including Germany, were displaced. 8 million of the approximately 11 million displaced persons in Europe were found in Germany. They included about 6 million civilians who volunteered or were forced to work, 2 million prisoners of war, and 700,000 survivors of death camps. After the war, 1.2 million people who had been forced to leave their homes in Eastern Europe refused to go back, which caused a large-scale refugee crisis. Germany's economy was significantly impacted by forced labor both during and after World War II. One essential component of Germany's economic exploitation of its conquered lands was the employment of forced labor. Economic losses were exacerbated by mistreatment of foreign laborers and prisoners of war. Abuse reduced the amount and caliber of human capital in colonized nations. This double loss, economic dislocation during the war and depletion and perversion of the labor force afterward, was the result of Nazi Germany's extensive economic prisoners of war and foreign labor exploitation. Millions of ethnic Germans were driven from Eastern European nations after the war. A significant number of refugees entered Germany as a result of this forced migration. One of the most important moments in European history was the flight and expulsion of Germans during and after World War II. The exodus of ethnic Germans from various Eastern and Central European countries, including Czechoslovakia, as well as the former German provinces of Lower and Upper Silesia, East Prussia, and the eastern parts of Brandenburg and Pomerania, which were annexed by Poland and the Soviet Union, was the result of post-war Europe's geopolitical and ethnic reconfiguration. Churchill had, at least since 1942, advocated for the Germans to be driven out of the occupied regions, working with the governments of Poland and Czechoslovakia that were living in exile there. Stalin, in collaboration with other communist leaders, devised a strategy to forcibly remove all ethnic Germans residing east of the Oder and from territories that were occupied by the Soviet Union as of May 1945. Millions of individuals from Central and Eastern Europe were relocated either permanently or temporarily between 1944 and 1948, including German nationals and persons of German ancestry. Approximately 12 million Germans had left East Central Europe and were forced into Allied-occupied Germany and Austria by 1950. The West German administration placed the figure at 14.6 million, which included 1 million ethnic Germans who had resided in Nazi Germany-conquered countries during World War II, ethnic German migrants to Germany after 1950, and children born to expelled parents. The lives of the Germans who were compelled to flee their homes and possessions were significantly impacted by the deportation. Between 500,000 and 2.5 million Germans are thought to have perished during the deportation. The people who were sent away also had a big effect on Europe's politics and economy. The Allied powers constructed camps to house displaced people, including prisoners of war and survivors of concentration camps, which resulted in an additional displacement crisis. Nazi Germany ran over 1,000 concentration camps along with smaller camps within its borders and in areas of German-occupied Europe during World War II. The initial concentration centers were founded in March 1933, a short time after Hitler assumed the position of German Chancellor. The concentration camps were solely supervised by the SS after the 1934 purge of the SA, first through the Concentration Camps Inspectorate and then through the SS Main Economic and Administrative Office. Communist Party of German members made up the majority of the jail population at first, but as time went on, arrests of habitual criminals, asocials, and Jews were made. Individuals from German-occupied Europe were detained in concentration camps following the start of World War II. There were around 1.65 million registered captives in the camps, with approximately 1 million dying during their confinement. The majority of the deaths happened in the latter half of World War II, and among the 700,000 prisoners listed as of January 1945, at least 1/3 did so. The camps were progressively liberated in 1944 and 1945, subsequent to Allied military triumphs, notwithstanding the tragic loss of hundreds of thousands of detainees during the death marches. Numerous old camps now house museums honoring the victims of the Nazi government, and the system of Nazi concentration camps has come to represent brutality and terror on a global scale. Alright, now we move to the second part, which is the consequences of the crisis. The displacement and refugee crisis has resulted in a humanitarian situation with millions of people without basic essentials such as food, housing, and healthcare. These individuals are unable to live their lives as they were before the crisis. After World War II, Germany had to deal with a big number of refugees. There were about 11 million displaced persons in Europe after the war, and 8 million of them were in Germany. Approximately 6 million civilians served as forced laborers and volunteers, 2 million were prisoners of war, and 700,000 were survivors of concentration camps. Most of the displaced people went home voluntarily between May and September 1945, with military officers from the Allies supervising an estimated 33,000 displaced persons, leaving each day. But by the end of September, 1.2 million people who had been forced to leave their homes stayed in Germany and refused to go back. Significant relief efforts were made in Germany after the war to help with the displaced population's immediate humanitarian needs, as well as the nation's long-term economic recovery. The crisis victims were psychologically traumatized to a great extent since they had seen or suffered unspeakable tragedies throughout the conflict. The recovery process took a long time and was difficult. Following World War II and the division of Germany into East and West, the German people suffered severe and varied psychological anguish. They suffered from PTSD. One of the most common symptoms is panic attacks brought on by wartime memories, such as hearing a fire engine arrive on scene. They experienced transgenerational trauma. Germans in their 40s and 50s, known as the Kriegsenkel, or grandchildren of the war, recognized the fundamental effects of the war on their lives and mental health. These symptoms have frequently been mistakenly diagnosed as depression. They believe that unresolved war traumas that were carried down to them by their family are mostly responsible for their emotional issues, including depression, anxiety disorders, marital breakups, and job troubles were passed down to them by their families. They endured shame and silence. While the horrors of the Nazi government in World War II were widely addressed internationally, things were far more difficult in Germany. Remaining silent regarding one's personal wartime experiences has had far-reaching effects. Men experiencing psychological damage from the war were frequently labeled hysterical in Germany, which had terrible repercussions. The practice of therapy typically included the use of nationalistic symbols and an idea of German manhood, which gave the impression that rehabilitation involved discipline. Alright, we are going to the third part now, that is overcoming challenges and how Germany responded to these challenges. With the help of international humanitarian organizations, the German government initiated emergency relief measures to provide urgent assistance to individuals affected by the disaster. From 1946 to 1952, the United States extended a comprehensive $29.3 billion in aid in response to this humanitarian crisis. Approximately 30% of this total was allocated as economic loans, while the remaining 60% was allocated as military aid. This aid was part of about $11 billion in aid to Europe. Most of that money was meant to help people right away who were having trouble with their social, economic, and political problems, rather than making long-term plans for security. Initiated in 1949, the Marshall Plan allocated $1.4 billion specifically for the purpose of fostering economic recovery. Approximately $13 billion in economic and technical assistance were allocated to Western Europe between 1947 and 1952. The impacted populations received food, housing, and medical attention thanks to this aid, among other uses. 12 million Germans were detained as Allied prisoners of war in Europe after the war, 2 million of whom never made it back home. Germany developed initiatives and programs to aid in the integration and resettlement of displaced people. This meant setting up social support networks, language lessons, and job training. Germany has made an attempt to face its history during the war and encourage rapprochement and healing among the impacted communities. This covers memorials, educational activities, and debate programs. Some sections of German society belong to penitentiary organizations, most notably religious organizations that contacted France and the newly formed State of Israel. Millions of people of German descent throughout Europe faced an uncertain future following the conclusion of the war. Many were relocated under duress. Camps for displaced people were built in Germany, Austria, and Italy. They were mostly used by former Nazi concentration camp inmates and immigrants from Eastern Europe. These camps offered displaced people a place to stay temporarily. Every Allied country assumed accountability for the displaced individuals inside their respective regions of Germany. They set up emergency stations where the refugees could get food, shelter, and medical care until they could get to safety. A significant refugee problem was brought on by the 1.2 million displaced people from Eastern Europe who refused to go back home after the war. Most of these displaced people, sometimes known as the last million, had left their home country and moved to the US, Canada, Australia, and other countries by 1951. The concentration camps that housed displaced people in Germany after World War II were shut down in the early 1950s. Numerous displaced individuals were either resettled in new countries or repatriated to their countries of origin as a result of the post-war immigration initiatives of Allied powers. After World War II, Germany was faced with a massive influx of displaced people and refugees, which presented the nation with a significant dilemma. Millions of people were compelled to flee their homes in search of safety, causing great human misery. Germany, on the other hand, was able to overcome many of the hurdles and begin the healing process through emergency relief efforts, reconstruction, and the dedication to integration and reconciliation. As a direct consequence of this, Germany has emerged as an illustrative model of fortitude and compassion in the face of misfortune. That's all we have for today on this episode. There is a lot more to this whole Germany splitting, World War II and everything. I will continue to work on these parts. Thanks for staying here with me. I'm Sundeep. I'll see you soon.
This is the Sundeep Show.